Good evening, everyone. My name is Edwin Lamboy. I'm the interim dean of the City College School of Education, and I'd like to welcome you to Unpacking Segregation in New York City Public Schools to promote equity, integration, and justice. This is the first of many events that the School of Education is going to host in the next year to celebrate our 100th anniversary. It's a very important moment for the City College School of Education. So what do we mean when we talk about segregation in New York City public schools? A recent New York City Council report on school diversity helps us answer this question. First, while the demographic breakdown of New York City public schools is 40.6% Hispanic, 25.5% Black, 16.2% Asian, 15.1% white, and 2.7% representing multiple race categories, 34.3% of white students attend a school with more than 50% white students, and 74.6% of Black and Hispanic students attend a school with less than 10% white students. With regard to socioeconomic status, 71.1% of Hispanic students and 67.8% of Black students attend schools where more than 75% of all students experience poverty. The data show equally disproportionate trends when it comes to numbers of English language learners and students with disabilities. There's also been a lot of debate concerning our specialized high schools in the city. These schools, which provide access to the highest level of academic achievement in the city, have admissions criteria that have historically favored some groups and excluded others. Of all students who attended these specialized high schools during school year 18-19, 61.6% were Asian, 24.3% were white, 6.3% were Hispanic, and 3.9% were Black. So we have a school system in which students from certain groups do not get the same opportunities to excel because of life circumstances, while other groups seem to have more access to a path that leads to academic and ultimately personal growth and success. Why is it important for us to have this conversation? For most of you, the reasons are obvious. And if you're not in this group, the reasons will become very clear during this event. However, I would like to mention one that I believe is of paramount importance. The landmark 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision intended to put an end to segregation in schools and promote integration. Nonetheless, 67 years later, we're talking about numbers that clearly highlight the fact that our school system does not represent our city's total student population. We need to pause, think, and take action, and that's why we're here today. I'd like to invite everyone to submit your questions in the Q&A room, and if your question is directed at a specific panelist, please write his or her name. And now I'd like to introduce to you Professor Bruce Cans. He is the chair of the Workshop Center Subcommittee of the School of Education Centennial Committee. Professor Cans, welcome everyone.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming. Thank you, Dean Lamboy, and a special thanks to Dean Lamboy for the support you provided to make this evening's discussion possible. Before we get started, I want to make two announcements. This evening's discussion, as Dean Lamboy has said, is sponsored by the City College School of Education, the Workshop Center for Open Education Subcommittee at City College, and the Black Studies program at City College. And I want you to know that we are recording you. My name is Bruce Cans, and I will be your host for the evening. I am an adjunct lecturer at CCNY. Before I came to City College, I spent 35 years in New York City public schools. As a white teacher and adjunct, I'm out of my comfort zone. The topic tonight is very important for me because we're confronting the systemic nature of the racist system that I've spent my life working in. And there's so much that I don't know about racism. In individual ways, as a teacher and then as a principal, I have tried to push back against racist policies in curriculum and the way we treat students. Sometimes I've been successful, sometimes not. Tonight, I am representing the Workshop Center for Open Education Subcommittee. We've organized this event to examine the impact of the continuing segregation in New York City DOE public schools. Our committee wanted to focus on this issue because in the time of COVID and Black Lives Matter, we need to reimagine public schools as just and equitable learning environments. As Dean Lamboy said, 67 years ago, the Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, Supreme Court decision established that separate was inherently unequal. A Supreme Court decision based in part on Doctors Kenneth and Mamie Clark's Doll study. At the time, Dr. Kenneth Clark was a member of the CCNY faculty. Even so, New York City public schools remain segregated in one of the most richly diverse cities in the world. We come together this evening to examine the structures and systems that maintain segregated public schools. We will engage with education advocates and CCNY students and alums to gain greater clarity and urgency in the fight to finally integrate and fully fund excellence for every public school and every child. Now, just to introduce the panel, we are joined this evening by Senator Robert Jackson, a longtime education advocate as a District 6 school board member, a member of the New York City Council, and now my state senator. Senator Jackson once walked 150 miles from New York City to Albany to win equitable funding for New York City public schools. Dr. Salas-Ramírez is a neuroscientist on faculty at CCNY's Sophie Davis CUNY School of Medicine. She is a dedicated education advocate and DOE parent. We have Shankiel Winfield, a current CCNY student, who will share her experiences in New York City DOE schools. And Mahadi Walrund is a recent master's degree recipient from CCNY, who is an English language arts high school teacher in a school right across the street from City College. Once we have heard from each of the panelists, there will be time for them to engage with each other and then two CCNY students. Then we'll open the conversation to you in the audience. Please share your comments and questions in the question and answer section so that our curators, Leonard Lewis, Beverly Falk, and Nancy Cardwell, can share them with the panel. Thank you again for joining us, State Senator Jackson.
Well, let me thank you, Bruce, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Robert Jackson. I'm a state senator that represents 13 miles of Manhattan, including Marble Hill, Inwood, Washington Heights, West Harlem, Upper West Side, Midtown, and I go into the Chelsea area. And the bottom line is, it has school districts 6, some of District 5, some of District 3 in Manhattan. And if you know the districts I'm talking about, there's 32 school districts in New York City. So those are some of the districts that I represent in the New York State Senate. But the most important thing is to focus now on the continuous racism and segregation that exists in our public schools, not only in New York City, but the entire country. And so this forum tonight, Unpacking Segregation in New York City public schools to promote equity, integration, and justice. And that's a lot. And so I hope that we will get to that in order to make sure that at least we come out of this with some information that we did not know that would help us to help one another in order to tear down the system of racism in our system, and also to know a little bit about the history, some of the issues and options and integration. And so with the panelists tonight, you're going to hear from them specifically in details, but I wanted to mention to you as someone and that is going to moderate the discussion tonight, my experience as a parent activist started some time ago because our three girls, my wife and my girls, are 45, 40, and 34. And they have all gone through the public school system here in New York City. And believe me, that as a parent activist, we have to make sure that we do the best we can to educate our children and all of the children, not only in New York City, but New York State and the entire country. I think that that's why I've adopted the position that they're all my children. And while I'm advocating for my children, I'm advocating for all the others. And my involvement in education goes back as a parent activist and then on Community School Board 6 for 15 years, where I led the entire school board in the litigation, the campaign for fiscal equity versus the state of New York, where a lawsuit was filed because they were cheating our children and discriminating against our children in the funding formulas in which how much money New York City got. And so I tell you, sometimes the road is long and it goes up and it goes down, but if you stay focused on what you have to do to ensure to achieve equity, to achieve integration, to achieve justice, and to make sure that every child, as per our New York State Constitution, is guaranteed an adequate education. And we called it, when I say we, the attorneys and advocates in the campaign for fiscal equity lawsuit in which we filed in 1993, we called it a sound basic education. And sometimes I used to joke and going into classrooms and asking people, how many of you parents want your children to receive a sound basic education? Raise your hand. And I do like that. And mostly everyone raised their hand. And I said, no, you don't. That's the minimum requirement that the state of New York is obligated to give. And so basically what this is doing tonight is clearly communicating to everyone, and many of you have known this, about the situations that exist and where we are now and what we're trying to do and go forward. So that's what this is about. And I say to you that in the campaign for fiscal equity, I and many other people in 2003 walked 150 miles from the Appellate Division First Department, and that's an appellate court of the Supreme Court, and they're located at around 26th Street and Fifth Avenue. We walked from there all the way up Broadway, up to Albany, to the highest court in the state of New York, the Court of Appeals. And why did we walk there? Because the decision of the Appellate Division, in one of the times that we went in front of them, basically said that the state was only obligated to educate our children equal to a 6th grade in reading and 8th grade in math. And that's when I said to our attorney, Michael Rebell, no way can the highest court in the state of New York agree that that's the type of education that our children should receive. And so sometimes it only takes one person to start a movement. I didn't start a movement, but many parents advocated and fought for and walked to Albany. And we finally won after 13 years of litigation, where we went to the highest court on 3 different occasions in that lawsuit. And so people said, well, what do we gain? Because the system is broken. People are not being educated. Well, I say that, you know, anytime the highest court defines what the Constitution meant by saying that every child is entitled to an adequate education. And let me tell you what the highest court basically said in its decision, that every child should graduate from high school knowing how to read, knowing how to write, knowing how to serve on a jury, and being able to hold competitive employment, not repetitive, flipping burgers all day long, but competitive employment. That's what the highest court said, the minimum standard of education children should receive. And I'd say to you that our children are still not receiving that minimum standard of education. And that's why the fight and struggle continues even as of today. On a continuous basis, we fight the struggle to ensure that. And one of the factors of holding that up is money. In fact, billions of dollars are still owed to our children in order to provide the services that they need, like small class sizes, like guidance counselors, like college advisors, and all of the other things that our children need to get a good education. So I'd say that, and I have a lot more to say, but I am not going to continue, but you should know that this is about equity, integration, and justice. And knowing that the CUNY, CCNY, CUNY School of Education has been around for 100 years, knowing that you have many, many other people that have advocated over this time, and knowing that it is continuous, it's like you run a relay race. And when you run your leg, then you pass that baton on to the next person until the race is won. So it's a continuous battle and struggle. I say that to you. And now I would like to move the matter and turn it over to the first speaker that we're going to have. And I believe that is Dr. Clarice Salas-Ramírez. Bruce.
Thank you, Robert. Okay, Dr. Clarice Salas-Ramírez, welcome.
Hi, everybody, and thank you. I want to correct Robert a little bit. Robert did start a movement. We're still moving with Robert, and literally and figuratively, as he also uses his running examples, like he literally is running all the time. So, and we try to run alongside him. So I just want to make sure that that's uplifted and elevated in this space. I am honored and privileged to be on this panel with such amazing individuals. Although I am faculty at the CUNY School of Medicine, I'm going to talk to you today a little bit as a parent, as an education activist, as somebody that is relatively new to the education system in New York City. I have a 9-year-old who attends Central Park East 1. And that's actually how I met Bruce when my son was 3 years old and struggling at his preschool, engaging with educators that weren't necessarily culturally responsive, as he identifies as Black, and I'm Puerto Rican. I needed to find like-minded people that would know how to support children in a holistic way. And at the time, our senior associate provost, Doris Cintrón, who also was the dean of the College of Education, was like, you need to talk to Bruce Cans, and you need to learn about Central Park East 1. And how lucky was I that I lived in East Harlem, and that was one of my district schools. And so my son has been attending Central Park East 1. That's one of the few integrated schools in the city. It's also one of the first progressive public schools in the city. And it has a strong history and relationship with City College and the School of Education. So I'm very blessed to have access to all of these individuals, these professionals, these educators, to also inform me in terms of how to best support my son. And so I became really active in the education system since my son was a pre-K-er. I'm currently the president of the Community Education Council for District 4. I'm also part of several advocacy groups, New York City Opt Out, Parents for Responsive, Safe and Equitable Schools, as well as the Black Lives Matter at Schools Week of Action. So in all of those spaces, we are talking about several things that will address a segregation in the New York City public schools. We are officially one of the top segregated systems in the whole entire country. and we are bound to district lines. Our kids are not going to integrated schools, and studies have shown that integrated schools benefit all children. All children benefit from having a Black teacher. All children benefit from having culturally responsive and sustainable education. And so some of the things that the New York City Department of Education can do is, one of the things we should advocate for in general is to do away with mayoral control. Mayoral control is actually restricting the way that we can have governance and input into the policies that involve any aspect of education. Even though I am part of a community education council and I'm privy to information, I have very limited power to inform those policies. And so even though we have a school board that's called the Panel for Education Policy that Robert was a part of, still the mayor has the power to implement all sorts of different policies that continue to perpetuate the systemic racism and continue to support segregation in our schools. One of them being these admissions policies. So as Dean Lamboy mentioned, we're still upholding the SHST as the only way to enter into specialized high schools. Now, this whole notion of like, which schools are good and which schools are bad and how we classify that, that's also up for debate. But we're talking about 8 schools that are considered elite schools. Unfortunately, that's not where the segregation, the only place where the segregation exists. The segregation also exists as students enter the system. We have 3K and UPK programs that are segregated. They are they're not found in all places across the city. It's very select. They're also not supporting a play-based curriculum. And so folks are pushing on that. If you're interested, they're actually going to start looking for a new director for the early childhood education program. So be on the lookout for that. But as young as 3.5-year-olds, students up to this year were being tested to enter gifted and talented programs. This was a test that was given to 15,000 to 30,000 children. We spent millions of dollars on giving this test that initiated this, this status quo of segregated schools. So roughly 1,500 to 2,000 children entered these gifted and talented programs that were predominantly testing for access, so test prep, and affluence. So the only thing that these tests are telling us is who has access to test prep and who has access to money, which again initiates this segregation. Roughly 6% of the children that are in these gifted and talented programs are Black children. With that, we also have some very strict district lines, and we know that the district lines are being drawn because of housing, and I'm sure Senator Robert Jackson can talk about that, in addition to the lack of funding and resources that we have in our Black and brown schools. And so Senator Jackson talked about how he fought for this money. We still don't have this money. We're currently fighting for this money. And we have an opportunity right now to fight for some stimulus money that the federal government has awarded each state. And so we have to make sure to support the bills that Senator Robert Jackson puts on the floor that will force Governor Cuomo to give us the money that our New York City public schools are entitled to. They owe us $3.4 billion, not to mention what we should be entitled to in order to support schools during the time of COVID. I also want to mention that schools are classified as schools that are good schools or failing schools based on high stakes standardized testing. So children are given tests from the ages from 3rd grade to 8th grade, and then they have to take regents. We know through several studies that these tests are racist. They're biased towards children that come from that are English language learners. They're biased towards children that have IEPs. And so once again, we're using these tests that are not developmentally appropriate to classify children and to classify schools. And depending on who performs better or worse on these tests, these schools are then classified between failing schools or schools that are in good standing. But when you have a school that doesn't have the funding or the resources to support their students, how do we expect them to perform to a certain level when they don't, again, have access to those resources? Currently, the city and the state have filed a waiver for these state tests, but we need a Secretary of Education that will actually waive these tests for these children. And it's another fight that a lot of us are advocating for at this time. One of the things that I appreciate about having my son in a progressive school is the fact that we use holistic assessments. And so as part of the School of Education, I'm sure you're always thinking about how to best evaluate children and how to best understand their needs. And so we also need to have conversations, especially now that people are talking about learning loss, and we can talk about that later, what these assessments need to look like so that we can support children where they are, and so that we can move them along. We need to recognize that our Black and Latinx children have gone through some significant intergenerational trauma, have experiences that most of our teacher workforce does not understand. We're dealing with a curriculum that is not culturally responsive. And so in turn, we're not giving them opportunities to be able to excel. We're not centering our youth in the way that we engage with them in their classrooms. And so we have to move the conversation forward. When we talk about learning loss, what is it exactly that we're trying to say? We have a lot of children that are actually enjoying being remote. Why? Because they're not in schools where they're experiencing racism, overt racism, microaggressions from their teachers. They're not walking into school buildings with metal detectors. They're not being policed everywhere that they go. They're actually at home, engaging with work, being creative, thinking outside the box because they finally feel like they have the freedom to do so. So I think this conversation needs to be all encompassing. We need to talk about policies the same way that we need to talk about what's happening in our classrooms in order to combat segregation. A lot of the conversations that we as parents of color have are, why would we want to be in an integrated school? Why do we want to be in a school with white parents that don't understand our background, that don't understand what our children need, that will classify our children, that will make statements like, your children don't work hard enough and my children work harder and they have education as a priority, only because of the color of our skin? And so there's a lot that we need to break down and unpack, and a lot of work that we need to do moving forward. And I'm super excited to hear about from Shankiel and from Mahadi that are really going to put this into a context for you so that we can actually end up with some actions and ways to move this conversation forward and inform the Department of Education on what exactly it is that we need to do to break down these segregated schools. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kaliris. Shankiel, jump right in, please.
Hello, everyone. Okay, so when I told everyone that I was going to be doing this panel talk and the topic was Unpacking Segregation in NYC Public Schools, everyone took a look at me and was like, segregation in public school? No. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions about NYC public schools is that it's diverse. In some ways, yes, it is diverse, but there is a lot of segregation that happens in NYC public schools. Like, I'm thinking about how when I was a child, I was never exposed to students that had physical disabilities or disabilities in general. I never once took a class with a child that had autism or anything like that. And I'm thinking now about what those kids were learning and how I was kept separate and how many kids were kept separate from kids that did have learning disabilities. We didn't even take a math class with them. We didn't take a art class with them. We certainly didn't take a gym class with them. It was like living in two different worlds. Like, I distinctly remember these kids being shipped off into another classroom and never seeing them again for the rest of the school year. When I think about further instances of segregation in NYC public schools, I think about my teachers. When I was a kid, I only came in contact with 2 Black educators. So in elementary school, I was exposed to only 2 Black educators. In middle school, only 2 Black educators. In high school, only 2 Black educators. And even in college, only 2 Black educators. I've noticed that there's this common pattern with the number just being 2. And a lot of schools don't think about the impact that it has on its students. When I was a kid, I'm afraid to say this, I'm embarrassed to say this, but I knew nothing about Africa. Nothing. Even when I entered college, like, I still knew nothing about Africa. I knew nothing about the motherland. I didn't even know much about my own country, which is Haiti. And when I say this to people, people look at me like, what? What do you mean? And it all makes sense, because the curriculum certainly isn't speaking about Africa. Even during Black History Month, the topic still isn't Africa. Instead, it's this generic conversation that primarily focuses around Martin Luther King and I'm forgetting her name. I have no idea why, but the context of the lesson plans always have to fall around Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and then that's where it all stops, and Rosa Parks as well. But Africa was never spoken about. And when you sit here and you think about this, this has such a negative impact on students of color, especially Black students. I remember when I was growing up, yes, schools were sort of diverse. I remember having Caucasian kids, Hispanics, Blacks, but when the topic came to Africa, a lot of the kids that were African were ashamed to actually admit that they were African. And I feel like the reason is because they were not being supported by a curriculum that spoke about their country, that introduced people to the culture, that took away cultural biases, even Asian culture too. There was so much shame that these students had because it was never spoken about in schools. When I entered college, my knowledge of Africa was very, I would say, dumbed down. I didn't know Africa had different parts. I didn't know Africa had tribes. I didn't know Africa had different dialects and languages. I didn't know any of that. I only encountered that when I entered City College, and I was exposed to students who were from Africa and they were proud of it. And just seeing that, it was awakening. It was just something that was really shocking to me. And when I further think about this curriculum that's being taught to students in schools, a lot of it is biased. Right now, I work in a cultural institution. It's a children's museum, and it's Black History Month. And we were talking about building a curriculum for our visitors and for their children. We wanted to introduce a book called Woke Baby by Catherine L. Brown. And this book would have introduced students to anti-racist practices. It also would have introduced students to the idea of progressiveness. But we couldn't do it. We could not do it. And that was because we had someone who was higher up than us, who was not a person of color. That person didn't want us to go ahead with that book because they thought the word woke was too hipster to introduce to students. And I found that, of course, like I was upset. I was so upset. And I remember going back and forth with this person, but of course, there was nothing that I could do because this person was higher up. And when you think about students and children that enter spaces like this, where they're not being exposed to the right literature that represents them, and they're not even being introduced into an environment where educators look like them, it impacts them so negatively, so negatively. I've worked in spaces where I was the only Black educator, and if there was someone who was of color, they were a security guard. And every day we would be allowing like NYC public school students to enter these environments. And of course, you know, no one saw anything wrong with it, but I saw the look on these kids' faces. I saw the way they looked at the security guard and the way they looked at the rest of the educators. They looked ashamed. Some of them looked like they were afraid to express themselves. And that's where I think a lot of people get the idea of NYC public schools and even the environments that NYC public schools allow their students to step into wrong. Everyone thinks it's so culturally diverse, but it's not. There's a lot of segregation that happens in NYC public schools. Let's take a look at the district. If you live in a neighborhood that's predominantly Caucasian, that's gonna make up most of your student body. If you live in a neighborhood that is predominantly upper class, that's gonna make up your school body. And even when I was a kid, the high school that I went to, we lived in a lower class neighborhood, borderline middle class. And I remember being given French textbooks that were all the way from the 80s. And I remember it continuing, advancing through French, and it was still the same textbook. It came to the point where I didn't even want to learn anymore because it was the same information being given to me. I remember being handed a test. I didn't even have to like think. I just wrote down the answer and it was an easy 100. And I think that's all like I have to say. That has to go with my experiences with being in NYC public schools and even working in environments that aren't so diverse. Thank you.
Thank you, Shankil. And now Mahadi.
Hello, everyone. How are you? I'm happy to be here. My name is Mahadi Warren, so I'm going to give some background to who I am and what I will be speaking on today. I have been working. I actually want to go backwards, just to Senator Jackson's point, that I actually am a product of the public school system. I've been a product of the public school systems all my life, from kindergarten all the way up to 12th grade, and even into my my college career. I went to Hunter College, which is a public institution under CUNY. I've also went to the glorious City College, go Beavers. And I just seen from an early age, just this type of segregation, just like my colleague spoke on. You would think, because we do live in New York City, that this is considered one of the most diverse cities in the world. However, how is it that we have the most segregated system, right, in the country? And I think back to me being a small child, and I kind of first experienced that. I'm from Harlem, New York. I was born and raised here. I come from a very culturally diverse family. But I remember just being in first grade and having a teacher where I don't, just to go back to Shankel's point, I didn't see a lot of teachers who did look like me at the beginning of my educational journey. Later down the line, when I got to, my post-secondary institutions, I saw more of that. But I will speak to the fact that when I was a small child, I do remember having teachers that I didn't feel connected to, and it's not so much on the physical, but also on the mental. I didn't feel like they related to a lot of my experiences as a young girl growing up in Harlem. The things that I saw, the things that I experienced, some of my friends in the neighborhood, my relatives, just things of that sort. And I think it actually starts from there. If you want to look at just how the districts are broken up, right? So we have this thing where we have districts. And just like Senator Jackson said, that he runs out of the District 6, that's actually a district that I belong to. When I was a student out of District 5, which is Lower Manhattan by Morningside Gardens, which is now the new name for it, right? Because it changed over time. But if you look at that, you can see that the schools that myself and my siblings attended were considered District 5, but directly across the street would be considered 3. And the reason being is because Harlem, if you're familiar with Harlem, the way Harlem is broken up, you will have a part that is completely impoverished, right? And you can literally just cross the street and then it's totally different. It's like a night and day. And you see this is a kind of sense of a modern day gerrymandering, right? A modern day redlining. Where does these district lines cross, right? Certain resources or access, availability, things of that sort. So I think that was my first experience as far as seeing this type of racism and segregated system when I was only 5 years old. But as I got to college, I saw it from a different perspective. So right now I currently work in this field and I see it as a teacher and as an educator. Statistics shows that 92% in District 6 alone, so I'm gonna focus more in District 6 and 5 because those are the districts that I'm the most familiar with, but alone, statistics show that 92% of the teachers are white, yet 92% of the teachers are white in districts like 1, 2, and 3. But when you come up the Hudson, right, and you come up in our area, you see that this 92% flips. So Black and brown students, Black and brown, Latinx, 90% of those same statistics are the students, yet 15% of the teachers represent them, look like them. So I think that's also where you see the difference. When you flip and then you go into different districts, you see we're further downtown, most of the teachers look like the students that they serve, but you don't really see that up here. And I feel like now that I am a teacher and I work in this field, I think about my experiences, right? So thinking about teacher preparation programs, right? How do we do this, right? How do we get teachers, more teachers of color in these classrooms? It's important and it's a known fact. Research can show you that students their first experience in elementary school carries them out through their post-secondary opportunities and what they become, right? So we had programs like NYC Men Teach. I think it's still running, if I'm not mistaken, it was very big when I did my undergrad. But you don't really hear talk about it anymore, right? When I actually searched on my path to become a teacher, that was one of the main reasons I decided to attend City College. I wanted a more diverse approach. I didn't want to just go to a school where I was the only Black student in the classroom, right? I didn't want to be sent to do student teaching and field work in a school where I didn't feel like I really connected to the kids or I made a big difference like I wanted to. And I had numerous offers, but I ended up settling and setting with the City College of New York because I did like that they had a program that spoke to this diversity and I got that exposure. But how can we transition that into our New York City public high schools? Another thing that I want to speak on, and that's a lot of my research, I plan to start a doctorate soon. And I really want to hone in on the CRSC initiative, right? It's not just that we have to teach culturally responsive curriculum just because it's the buzzword of the year, right? Equity is the buzzword, but how can we continue this, right? We have to look at things at decolonizing the classroom. So it doesn't only start with, hey, we have to figure out how to integrate our schools and eliminate these and implement these policies and eliminate these standardized testings, but how can we start from the beginning, right? So we always hear the talks and the debates about eliminating the specialized high school examinations, the gifted and talented programs, but what about in the early years, right? How can, just like Chankel spoke, she barely learned about her own history in a classroom. My experience has been fortunate for me. A lot of my learning came from at home and it also came from the school building too. But what about those students that are not fortunate enough to do have that at home? How do we start early of decolonizing the classroom where our students from K through 12th grade and even beyond are already exposed to this rich curriculum, right? Bringing in more teachers of color. How do we do that? How do we bring in more programs? How do we support these teachers when they're in the field? And how do we make sure that they stay? Because that is another issue that we have in this that's often kind of swept under the rug, but teacher retention, right, of teachers of colors. I work with teachers that I went to school with that often leave the field because they don't feel supported. They come in with this whole high hopes. They may do a program like Teach for America. They may do teaching fellows, but then once they get in the field, they don't feel supported and then they leave, right? And that's where the whole statistics goes down again. We lose teachers of colors, which is what students need to see themselves, not only in the classroom, but also in the curriculum. So how do we implement that where we decolonize the classroom early? And I think that starts with policies. I think it also starts with equal opportunity, resources. I can speak from now, like I teach remotely and it's a catch-22. Yes, it works for some students, but it doesn't work for a lot. And if you ask me, you can also see that the equity gap is widened now, right? Because a lot of students don't have internet. They don't have technology. They're not able to learn daily. How do we make sure we catch these students, whereas that segregation and that equity gap is not widening even further than it already is established? So I think we have to look at that very early on. We need to look at our teaching staff, our leaders. We don't have a lot of leaders of color. We need more of those. We need more programs just to push. And unfortunately, not everyone has these programs, but what can we do from the top to bring it down where it's just a trickle effect and that we get that, all right? So we also need to make sure that we hone in on our programs. How are we preparing our teachers? How are we keeping our teachers? How are we preparing our admin? How are we keeping our admin? How are we decolonizing our classrooms and things of that sort? So it's a lot, and I want to make sure that I don't take up all the time, because I know I see abundance of questions and I know we have to answer those, but that is some of the research and my interests, some of my experiences with being a student in the New York State public school system and also being a teacher as well.
Thank you, Mahadi. I want to talk about just the process now. We have a lot of questions that have come in and we're going to ask them, but we want to turn this part of the program over to having the panelists respond to each other's comments. After about 15 minutes of that, then there are two students from City College who are going to kick off the questions from the audience, and then we'll start to process the questions that you have asked. So I think we need to see all of the panelists on screen and then to have a conversation among the panelists.
So first, let me thank all of you for being a panelist. And it's very interesting to know that there are all three women and women of color. So I say that as a man, an African-American male, but I say to all of you, what most important is that our children get a good, rounded education. So Chantel, Miss Winfield, so you said you grew up in New York City and you were not exposed to basically being a Black woman, to Africa and the history of Africa and all of the things that go along with it. And that you got to learn when you were in higher education. So do you feel then that your education was appropriate or not appropriate?
I would say that my education was not appropriate. I went into college with the most, I would say the most prejudiced, toxic mindset. I even, like when I think about when I was a child, like especially 5th grade, like when you're not exposed to certain topics regarding your race and even cultural history and even topics of other people's races, you make certain racially insensitive comments. And I just think about the ignorance I had at that age. And it was a lot. It was a lot.
And was your schools predominantly people of color, Blacks and Latinx, or was it more diverse?
Educator wise,
Not
we only had
talking about students.
Students, okay, so students, it was predominantly Black. Mm-hmm. And the second population was Hispanic.
So I asked the doctor and Ms. Waldron, do you think that that was because of the zip codes in which she lived? And could you explain that to those that may not know how important zip codes are?
Or, you want to start?
Yeah.
So I'm not gonna go too deep into it because I want her, I know she has a great answer for this too, but I experienced this. Your zip code makes a lot of difference. Like I said, I'm someone that was born and raised in Lower Harlem, and I've seen that. Like I've seen a school across the street that would be District 5, and then you get to a little bit more of a residential area, a little bit more gentrified, and then it suddenly switches to 3. And even the way the schools looks physically are totally different. It's like night and day. And I've been to a school where, you know, maybe the roof is coming in, or maybe it's just that it needs a new paint job, or we have really old textbooks. But if you go to another school across the street to maybe do, I don't know, SAT prep or something, the technology is different, the resources are different. And you see that those zip codes make a huge difference. You even see who's admitted. If you look on, is it inside schools? You can see that. You can see a school that are like geographically across the street from one another and see a totally different like student demographic or population, and it's literally within walking radius. So zip codes do make a huge difference, not only in the TV show, you know, Beverly Hills 90210, but it does happen here as well and in our school systems. And she's laughing, but this is a real thing. This is a real thing indeed. And it's you know, it's disgraceful, but it is a real thing.
Mahadi, you just aged me, because 90210 was like my thing. Yeah, and so I mean, the scary thing also is that our schools get funding and these district lines are created based on property taxes. And so just like Mahadi is talking about, you know, when we have gentrified neighborhoods, that tends to then increase property taxes, and sometimes rezoning occurs to make sure that certain schools aren't in certain spaces. There's also a lot of politics involved. You can have, for example, schools that are citywide unzoned, and then all of a sudden a superintendent says, well, I don't want students from a certain district or from a certain location in the school based on political pressure or, you know, other factors. And so a lot of politics and a lot of money determines what sorts of not just resources, but who attends certain schools. It also impacts how many charter schools are in the district and the movement of privatization of public education. I just recently had a conversation with Councilman Ben Kallos, and he was like, oh yeah, I only have one school in District 2 that's co-localized with a charter school. And I'm like, as a District 4 parent, I'm like, do you know I have Success Academy and a whole chain of East Harlem Scholars Academy that are co-located, and we're fighting for space all the time, and you have one in all of District 2. So everything in terms of the dynamics of politics and money changes depending on your zip code.
Well, what if the Department of Education would say to you and to all of us that no, the amount of money that's allocated is based on, you know, the staffing of how much staff you have and the number of students you have, and there's no discrimination just because the majority of the students are Black and Latinx in this district or Caucasian in this district. Do you think that that is true? I mean, here you have Chancellor Carranza, who is a Latino. Go ahead.
Sorry, I don't know if I want to cut you off. I don't think that's necessarily true, because I think about the high school that I went to. We had approximately 3,000 students, and our school was Midwood.
Okay, go ahead.
And our school was practically ran down. We were using textbooks from the 80s. And what was troublesome about those textbooks from the 80s is you were advancing through higher levels of different languages and different grade levels, but the textbook was still remaining the same. And it was still that textbook from the 80s. And the textbooks were ripped. They were just beyond repair. And the students, we would all sit in the room and we'd be bored because we knew it already. We were passing the exams, yes, but if you were to really sit down and have a conversation with us about what we were learning, it would be crickets.
In Midwood High School at the time you went, or what was the ethnic breakdown of that school? Give or take.
So I would say it was predominantly Middle Eastern and African American.
Okay. Can anyone tell me, because I've heard where some schools, parents associations raise hundreds of thousands of dollars, $500,000 or more in order to help their schools. And how does that impact whether or not a school is successful or not, or as far as, one, are the parents more involved in their children's education, or that the parents of these children have a lot more wealth and they then pour money into the school system? Can anyone comment on that, if in fact you have any idea?
Yeah, I can certainly comment on that. I see that across the district. I do want to bring up something about budgets. So for example, as you mentioned, a lot of public schools, in terms of their budget, it's determined by the staff salary, but it's mostly determined by the number of students that are in those schools. If you have school districts that are being taken over by charter schools and charter schools making promises that in most cases they don't keep, and we can have that conversation some other day. But if you are giving or providing a community other types of options, then schools, our public schools are losing students. Now in the time of COVID, the Department of Education has lost about 41,000 students. Because of that, there are schools that are losing hundreds of thousands of dollars that were initially put in their budget, not to a fault of their own. We are in a pandemic. You also have schools that, with losing that money, will lose the resources that they need in order to support both in-person and remote learners. Because we have teachers that are remote teachers, we need substitutes in our schools, we need additional resources, we need social workers in the school to support children. And so a lot of us that are part of the community education councils are calling for an amnesty for our schools in order for them to keep this money that was allotted to them before COVID, before we had to deal with COVID. So that's one of the things that we're facing right now that is an important critical issue here in New York City, and one that I encourage people to get involved with in advocating for our public schools. I'm also in a district that has a large number of diverse schools and schools of choice. So we have progressive schools, we have 8 dual language programs, we have traditional schools the same way that we have a citywide gifted and talented school. So our citywide gifted and talented school, which is predominantly composed of white and Asian parents, have a PTA that can get up to $400,000 a year in funding. They're able to fundraise that money, they're able to tap into alumni, they're able to get those resources from other places in the community in addition to getting additional funding. I have a school that is a traditional public school across the street, PS7, that has $1 to its PA name. Why? Because it's a Title I school.
How much money? You said $1 million?
$1. It is a school that we as a CEC sometimes support in terms of their events. We have schools that can actually ask for some support from the CEC, and we try to support our community schools. But they don't even have enough money to like buy a couple of turkeys to celebrate Thanksgiving as a community, or, you know, have a trophy for a kid that wins a spelling bee. And so this is the reality of what we're living with when we continue to perpetuate segregation in our schools, and when we're classifying children and giving them tests and giving them access to certain programs that are only meant, again, for the affluent and privileged. And that is typically not our Black and brown students.
Yeah, and just to quickly pick, I wanted to bring up a point. I went to a really prominent, super successful high school back in the day. It's not like that anymore, unfortunately, but when I went, it was one of the premier high schools in Harlem. And a lot of our funding came from like non-for-profit CBOs, which are community-based organizations. But because we were in Harlem, we were Upper Harlem, we didn't get the property tax value, just, you know, as you spoke on. And we had old textbooks. You know, we used to go to travel to places, like we used to go to Europe and Asia and all these unique places, but we had 100-year-old textbooks. You know, some of our students, you know, my classmates went on to go to like Ivy League institutions and really prominent colleges, but they didn't really have the resources in high school. So a lot of it was dependent on the PTA and, you know, donors and philanthropists and things of that sort. So I do see that even now. I did see a question in the comments posing that, you know, you would have 2 different schools in the same building, and the resources are just spread out differently, or even the admission requires it differently. I can speak. I was a sub teacher at one point when I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a teacher. So I was like, well, let me sub teach first and let me see if I really I like this. I feel like I like to talk. I like to share knowledge and wealth, but I want to really get my feet wet with it. So I was a substitute teacher, and I worked in different schools all across the city. And I've seen it with my own 2 eyes. I've seen schools that had literally 2 schools in one building, but it served 2 different populations. Some had Apple computers, some had 90-something-year-old Dells. I've seen it, and it's crazy because they all fall under the same umbrella, which is the public school system, yet they were given allocated different resources, different types of funding. And you also find that schools that are in these inner cities and in these districts that you serve, Senator Jackson, and I work in and came out of, most of our funding come from fair student funding, right? With the special education, the IEPs, like we only get money if we have a number of students with IEPs. And what you do see is people often don't talk about this, but some students are diagnosed with it just to get the money, and they don't really have an IEP, but they're diagnosed because they get the money or they get the extra resources. So you see that happen too. Not so much all the time, but it is something that does happen.
But in my opinion, if that happens, that the educators that are labeling someone with an IEP when it's not true, that's committing fraud. And if you're saying that that's what's happening to receive additional funds based on a fair student funding formula, and people should know that if a average student without an IEP gets, let's say, one funding level, and a child with an IEP gets to 1.5, that brings more money. But I wanted to raise the issue about children with special needs. I mean, do you see that is higher in schools where the zip codes are basically for Black and brown people versus, the Upper East Side? Or what have you experienced about that? Because there's a large number of students with IEPs in which, especially during this pandemic, they're not getting the services that they rightfully deserve and rightfully what they need. Have you experienced any of that, or do you have any comments about that, in order to make sure that every child, no matter what your ability is, has the opportunity to receive a sound basic education?
Yeah, so District 4 and lots of the districts in Harlem and Upper Manhattan have a large population of children that have individualized education plans. A lot of the children in District 4, most of them are for behavioral dysregulation because they experience so much trauma in their life. We have a lot of students that are in temporary housing. I think we need to be really careful in our communities of color when we talk about this for two reasons. One is a lot of white families are super happy to have an IEP because that means that their kid gets to get pulled out from their classroom and have individualized services. So I think that one conversation that we need to have is like the stigma around an IEP and how we actually talk about IEPs and the services that are mandated to our children. However, I will say that because of the how they rolled out this reopening, particularly during the time of COVID, our children, our Black and brown children that have IEPs are typically the ones that get short-shafted when it comes to their mandated services. Or they are given a plan that is something that the school cannot support because of the lack of funding and the lack of resources. And so it becomes really, really difficult, particularly now in the time of COVID. If there's anybody that's taken a hit, it's the kids that have IEPs. A lot of them would be better suited or better fitted if they had some in-person instruction and in-person support. And that was something that the Department of Education did not prioritize. We have a lot of kids that are supposed to be in ICT classrooms and have access to both a general ed and a special ed teacher. That is not happening, and it's not happening across the board. And the DOE was basically showing up in spaces and being like, it's not going to happen, sorry. And so now it's a matter of continuing to push the Department of Education to provide all students with compensatory services. We have to rethink of children in District 75, where they have special needs, where they're aging out. And this last year, they weren't receiving the support that they deserved, and really, really focus on providing these services to students attached with the money that comes with it in our Black and brown communities. So I think it's a twofold conversation in terms of how it is that our communities think about IEPs and how we support our children, but also getting the resources for the mandated services.
Let's talk about leadership. So, and this is a question to all of you, but when you talk about leadership at the Department of Education in New York City, you're talking about, you have Chancellor Carranza, and you ask, depends who you ask, he's great. Depends who you ask, he's not great, get rid of him, fire him. Then you have obviously the mayor, and then did you have, as you know, you have a State Board of Regents. The State Board of Regents, for those who don't know, there are 17 members of the New York State Board of Regents elected by the state legislature, meaning the Assembly and Senate, come together as a legislature and appoint these members for a 5-year term. And 4 of them are at large. But just recently, and this is for consideration, one of the State Board of Regents, Dr. Lester Young Jr., was elected to be the chancellor of the State Board of Regents. And he is a Black male, okay? But also the president of State University of New York, State Education Department, is Dr. Betty Rosa, a Latina that was the executive superintendent in the Bronx, was a principal in District 6. And so my question is, do you think that it makes a difference from a leadership point of view, setting the foundation in order to have people of color that I just mentioned in the leadership? You think that will make a difference as far as our children's lives, as far as getting a good education with diversity and integration and justice, not necessarily tomorrow, but in the near future? So, Ms. Winfield, what do you think? And Ms. Waldron and Dr. Salas-Ramírez, what do you think?
Absolutely. It goes back to what we spoke about representation, right? So I always get the question like, you look like a kid, or like, you look like you're 18 or something. And, you know, students, not only speaking of students, but in general, if you see people in these higher ranked positions and these leadership roles, making these decisions that they may have a direct, you know, connection to, or making these policies, right? Because it starts from the top up. So we're always saying like, how can we change this at the lower level, right? Or does our voice really make a difference? When you do see that this whole push for equity and representation at the top of the chain is there, that just leads more to, I mean, it's not to say that you're not going to hold them accountable or anyone accountable just because they may come from the same neighborhood or look like you, but I do think it definitely makes a difference. It goes back to that whole representation aspect. Just we're always pushing, right? Even for women, you made a comment earlier about our panelists are 3 women of color. Mm-hmm. That makes a difference, right? So I do think absolutely that having those executives at the top and beyond who represent, you know, the student population, even if they don't come from where they come from demographically, so to speak, just seeing that there, right? Or that type of rapport just being present absolutely makes a huge difference on that. And I think you can contest to that too, Senator Jackson. Like, I'm sure you've made lasting impressions on people, and, you know, people see you in the street, they're like, oh my God, I could get there one day, right? So it definitely does make a difference, and it's a huge thing, so yeah.
I would like to say something. I agree with what Mahadi said 100%. I think about myself, and some of the workplaces I've worked in, I've never once encountered a woman of color who was in charge. It wasn't until recently where I started working at my current workplace now, and I saw a woman of color who was a director of the education at this museum, that I felt inspired. I felt confident. I took a look at myself as an individual, as a student, and I said, hey, like, I think that's something that I want to become. That's something that I want to look at and say, okay, I want to push myself further. I take a look at the classrooms that I'm in when I do attend as a student, and there's not that many men there. There's not that many men of color there. And from their perspective, I'm thinking that must be extremely uncomfortable to be in a classroom where someone does not look like you, where you are not being represented. And even on, I think about my experience where I was taking a Black history course. I remember being so excited. And I was told that the educator that I was gonna get was a Black woman, and she knew her things, and she was entertaining, and you would just get drawn into whatever she was saying. I was so excited to attend that class. I step in, and it's not a Black educator. Instead, it's a white educator. And I remember being so uncomfortable listening to her speak. What I was learning was completely different from what my friends learned. And they also took that class, but they took it before me. And they had the educator that was Black. They learned about They learned about parts of Africa. They learned about the Caribbean diaspora. They learned about all these things. What did I learn about? I learned about Carnival. So it was two different learning experiences. And did I feel confident as a student? No, I felt very discouraged. And even when I think about regents, regents, I remember when I used to take regents as a kid, I remember going into it feeling extremely nervous. And I think I would have felt more confident if I did have educators that did look like me, if I did have educators that were able to relate to my learning style and relay information to me and my peers in a way that we could all understand it, instead of just listing numbers on a board and instead of making derogatory comments. I think my education would be completely different. So I think representation in classrooms, I think all of this matters.
Yeah, representation is incredibly important. But what I don't want us to forget is that in that representation, when we do have leaders of color, we also have to hold each other accountable to the community, because not all skin folk are kinfolk, right? We have so much internalized racism in our own communities and so much work that we have to do on ourselves, that we have to always look out to see, are they really culturally responsive? Are they really engaging in anti-racist practices? And who our allies are and who we're trying to elevate. I'm super excited about Betty Rosa being commissioner, because she's really advocated for a revamp or revisiting of the Regents exams and high stakes testing. She said that before in other spaces. We need to hold her accountable to that. She doesn't get a pass just because she's a commissioner now. Same with Lester Young. He led the Black Male Initiative throughout the city and was an amazing role model. We need to continue to have those conversations. Are we really engaging in restorative justice practices and not harsh disciplinary actions in schools? Are we really supporting our Black children in these spaces? So representation is critical across the board. Myself as a medical educator, that's a constant conversation, but we need to always make sure that we're holding our own people accountable for creating safe spaces for each other and in community.
Let me interrupt for a minute, please, because I want to introduce two students from City College, Natia Guerrier and Aisha Abdul Fattah, and they have some questions that they would like to ask, and I'm sure there'll be more responses from the panelists, and then we have questions from the audience that I also want to be able to put to you, so thanks. Natia, do you want to start us off?
Hi, well, I'm Aisha.
Hi, Aisha, I'm sorry.
Nice to meet all of you. Thank you so much for speaking, sharing all this information. I was taking notes like the entire time. I think these conversations are very important. And I have two questions. One of them is in terms of what you guys were talking about in terms of funding and budgets. Throughout the summer, especially, and still now, I hear a lot of talk of like defund the police, and I'm wondering if you guys feel like defunding the police is a potential solution to this issue. And if it's not, then what is another, potential solution to solving the issue of like lack of funding and lack of resources in our schools? And that's my first question.
Well, I can give you a little bit. For me, even though when people say defund police, depending on who you ask, they want to basically cut out all funding for police or take a chunk of it out. And others want to recategorize it for, community policing and other stuff like that. But the bottom line is that put that aside. Before even defund police was on the agenda, going back, let's say a year, that New York City schools were underfunded by several billions of dollars under the formula for the Campaign for Fiscal Equity. And so that's what we need. We need for the governor and the state legislature to fund our schools like they are supposed to be funded based on the funding formula. Let's start there. And so when I say let's start there, even though the court decision in 2006, but Michael Rebell, the same attorney, 5 years ago, he went back into court because we didn't get the money that we were entitled to and suing them again to get the money that we rightfully deserve. And Michael Rebel, he doesn't look like you and I. But let me tell you, he is a fighter for the children of New York City. I've seen a partner in the law firm of Simpson, Thatcher, and Bartlett years ago when we were talking about the educational system in New York City. I've seen him literally cry tears while he's giving the presentation, because that's how, I guess, underfunded and how discriminatory and everything else you want to say the school system was. And I know that his child was not in the public school system, but he was fighting for our children. And I say that again, lastly, for the individual in high school. I went to Benjamin Franklin High School. He put an application in my hand and he said to me, "Bobby, take this home to your mother and bring it back signed tomorrow." And that was an application for the Upward Bound program. And his name is Erwin Goldberg. And he was like the godfather for many of us who ran track at Benjamin Franklin High School and JFK High School up in the Bronx. Mm-hmm. And I say to you that about a year and a half ago, they put together a birthday celebration for 92 years young. And you know, all of the people in there, of the students of his, were Black and brown. So there's some good people out there that work for us, but defunding police, even before that occurred, we'd owed billions of dollars, and that's what we need to have. And anyone else can comment if they deem appropriate.
Yeah, of course, I agree with Senator Jackson. We're owed billions of dollars, but I do believe that I was on the streets this summer with my mask, socially distancing, advocating to defund the police in our New York City budget plans, because there are millions of dollars being put into the NYPD. They get the most money. They have the strongest police force across the country. Why aren't we putting that money in our schools? And so as a CEC president, our CEC collectively passed a resolution demanding for the removal of police from our schools, in addition to the defunding the police and putting that money towards our public schools, because locally, we also have to make smarter budget decisions to support our New York City public schools. So I think it's one step that we can make.
Okay.
Thank you.
If it's a short question, Aisha.
Oh, it's just, I was just thinking, like, you know, these conversations are really important, and I see that, you know, a lot of us here are people of color, and I'm just wondering how can we really like make sure that our white teachers, white counterparts, white students gain the empathy and care about what we experience as people of color, as much as we recognize, you know, that it's an issue in our schools. Because like we've been saying, just because maybe there is less segregation, that doesn't necessarily ensure that there is integration. So just a thought, but thank you.
Well, a quick response that you know, we need to communicate with each other and try to go into schools where you have diversity of students so that they can get to know one another, so they can learn together, and they see that, hey, she's another student like I. And that many people will tell you, no two students are at the same level. We all learn differently. So just communicating, educating ourselves about the diversity of our great city, hopefully that will bring about the type of changes. And that needs to be done at every level, not just students, but with educators and administrators and policymakers also.
Yeah, and also having those conversations. I think people often are fragile to address the elephant in the room. And we have to have those conversations. You see what happens when you're silent, and then you know, you see the calamity that happens. You also, it doesn't just start with trainings. I know there's something that we push within our system now, like, oh, if we do one implicit bias training, we're magically not racist anymore, right? So that doesn't happen. That has to be something that's continuous, right? And like Senator Jackson said, right? Like Dr. Ramirez said, right? You have to actually start from the policymakers and also hold people accountable. and just always have those conversations. Even if it feels like it's a little bit uncomfortable for the space that you're in, still have it, right? You have to address the elephant in the room. You can't be afraid to say things. You have to have a voice. And also bringing more diversity, right? I hate to use the term integrating because it's the year 2021, but we need that more, right? We need to have these spaces where we can talk about things like this. Like this conversation and this webinar that we're having right now should not only be happening at the City College of New York. This should be happening in every school, every college across the country, right? This is something that's, we all experience this. We deal with it in politics. We deal with it in our everyday lives. You know, so this is something that you got to keep it going, and you got to push and have the programs and not only just the one-day trainings or let me just do this training to get some credit for work. You got to have it and make a push for it too. And it also starts with you. So don't think because you don't have the accolades or, you know, you're not too deep into the field to have these conversations or to start a movement, you have to start it, right? Someone had to start to get it to finish. So yeah. And just be consistent with it too. Don't just think like, okay, well, I'll have it once a year and then it's out the window. You got to kind of be consistent with it too, you know?
I also,
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Shankir.
I don't know if I cut someone off, but I agree with everything that was said. Not only should we be having these conversations, but the curriculum should also be matching these conversations. In social studies classes, we talk about the Constitution being a living document. I believe that curriculum should also be a living document, that it should be breathing and changing with the times to make sure that cultures are being addressed, the times are being addressed as well. And I believe that these people should also be held accountable, and educators should be supported with these new curriculums so they can introduce new thoughts, new ideas, and anything that students feel like is being currently left out of the curriculum. Instead of teaching Shakespeare, let's switch it up. Let's teach something different.
Thank you to the panelists, and Aisha, thank you for that very provocative, important question. Natia, are you here?
She was just there and then she disappeared.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Hopefully she will reappear.
Let's hope. Okay.
I'm back.
Oh, there you are.
Hi, everyone.
The wonders of Zoom. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. I've been listening a lot to what you guys have been saying, and it's crazy to see how much I relate to it, especially because I grew up in the New York City public school system from pre-K to still now, because I go to City College, so still going to public school. And I was able to benefit from certain systems because I had originally entered the education system in a District 2 school. District 2 schools tend to get a lot more funding, and I noticed it. I went to middle school and high school on the Upper East Side with very affluent students. I went to one of the top public high schools on the Upper East Side, and
which one?
They got a lot of funding. I can't even lie. I went to Eleanor Roosevelt High School.
Okay.
And we always had a lot of funding. We always had a lot of programs. And of course, I'm so grateful that I got to benefit from those things. But I always realized that whenever I was talking about my education, whenever I was talking about the schools I went to, I always described myself as lucky. And I don't feel that that's a sentiment that should be used when you talk about your education, because education is a right you have. It's not, you shouldn't luck out because you got a good education. So my question is, what would be the best ways for students in general to have this lucky feeling, for them to be able to be in schools and programs where they feel like they're being challenged, where they will be able to, they will be able to have, I'm trying to find the right words. Well, they will be able to grow up and be successful adults, to be successful in college, where we won't need programs in college where it's like, oh, let's teach you how to write an essay. Because by the time you're 18, I feel like that's something that should be down packed. But some students, because of the inequality in the city, they aren't able to succeed in higher education. So yeah, that's my basic.
I have 1 or 2 questions for you. Where did you live at? Did you live on Upper East Side?
So I had first lived when I was in elementary school, I lived in Midtown, but for the rest of my life, I lived in Harlem. So I did not live in District 2, but I went to District 2 schools my entire life.
So, well, I think that people would say District 2 needs to open up and not be closed and think that they're the only ones that can go to District 2 schools. And quite frankly, it's being opened up, even if we have to force it open, because every child is entitled to go to a good school. And there are many schools in District 2 that are very good, okay? But, you know, District 2 has a policy that if you live in the district, then you have first choice at schools. And that's not how it should be. That every child should have the opportunity to go to one of those schools and not be looked at and say, by those that are making the decision, okay, this child doesn't fit the profile of our school, or this child doesn't live in the east side. So in essence, we need a clear situation where students could come in either by a strict lottery or by a system where they're not being discriminated against. So, and I know some people would disagree with me what I just said, but it needs to be opened up. That's for sure.
The only people that will disagree with you are the local District 2 parents, but the rest of us are right there with you. So the Department of Education has done away with the demographic preferences for District 2 schools. As of yesterday, they released the new G&T policy, which will be that a teacher is supposed to recommend children for the gifted and talented program. And from there, it's going to be a lottery. We can talk about like teacher bias on who really should be in a gifted and talented program. Again, different conversation. They don't seem to always get it 100% right. But yeah, you know, what's hard to hear is Nathia basically say, like, I felt lucky. What's hard to hear is the difference between a good school and a bad school. Like, schools in Harlem that are doing the work are freaking amazing. The only thing is they're in Harlem and it's mostly Black and brown folks, and they get labeled as failing schools because they don't have the resources that they're entitled to. And so that's what makes it hard, that we're constantly in this struggle. So, you know, I just want to make sure to uplift that. I also want to say that a lot of District 2 and District 3 parents have come together to create what we're calling a modern day segregationist group called Place. And I want everybody to be on the lookout for that. These folks are really getting into spaces and creating tables and pushing for continuing segregating our schools. And a lot of them are coming from District 2. And so I just want to elevate that. I also want to share an example. Again, District 4 is a couple of blocks from District 2. In December, my district was still owed 1,350 devices for students that still did not have devices since March. District 2 had all of their devices by September. Kids were able to start the school year with their devices. I have right now, as of last week, all of my requests have been taken care of, but there are still 91 children that have a device en route. And so again, these are the differences that we have just a couple of blocks away with those district lines.
But someone put in the chat, is it really about opening up all district schools, District 2 schools, or should we have every school well-funded and excellent for every child? I think it's both. Mm-hmm. I think it's both, because some people want their children to get outside of their local neighborhood. It's both. Nadia, any other questions that you may have?
No, not really, but I just really, oh wait, I did have one more question. It was about representation in the classroom, because like some of the panelists had talked about, I have had in my education maybe 5 Black teachers, and only two of them have been female. And one of them, she would had such a profound impact on me. And to this day, like I will always be grateful for what she did for me. And I was wondering how we can add representation in classrooms in a way that people aren't feeling like it's forced, or even with the curriculum, because I think a lot of pushback comes from people thinking, why are they doing all of these things so quickly? Why does it feel like they're forcing these sort of things when they need to happen? So I understand why they would speed it up to add that sort of representation. But what is the best way that you guys believe to have representation in the classroom and in the curriculum?
Well, for one, you said that it feels forced because it is forced. Like, that's just the honest question. A lot of it is forced. It's like, okay, so we're gonna push a certain amount right now, or we're gonna push this training, down people's throats just to get it out the way. But I think the way you can kind of combat that is that you have to create the spaces and open the opportunities, right? You have to open your hiring pool. You need to stop looking at specific teachers from a specific school or from a specific part of the city, right? And you do have that happen. You may have schools that, and I've experienced it. I've been in college for a while. I just finished this master's. I'm wrapping up another one, so I see it. Like you'll see certain schools want to hire teachers from a specific university only, right? That has a larger racial demographics, right, and student population. So you know that if this student went to this school for teacher education, they're probably not going to be, a person of color. Also looking at demographics. Even I can say myself, and I like to be very transparent in what I went through, and hopefully, because you ladies are in school now for this, so you probably will experience that at some point, but also counting schools out because you are not from that area. And I'm even guilty of doing that, where I would say, I would apply to the school, but I don't think I would really do well in this district. And that can go both ways. That could be from a Black teacher to a white teacher. Even Bruce spoke on that too, about how he said, as a white man, I still, worked at Central Park East. I worked in Harlem, but I realized that I had to take a step back and look at the students in which I was serving. So having that conscious, right, knowing that, like, don't just say, I'm going to do Teach for America or any type of organization just to be placed in an inner city school, just to say I did that for X amount of years. And then now I'm going to go into Westchester or something like that, right? It has to be more seamless. I think we need to open the hiring pool, look at teachers, encourage teachers, also the retention. You have a lot of teachers like myself who come from Harlem that may feel like they're not supported, and then they don't stay and then they leave. And that's where you kind of get that kind of diluted teaching, where you see, like, I don't really see people that look like me, because you probably think, like, how does it get to this point? And I think that from personal experience, it starts from not feeling like you could be a teacher or working in education or being a professor or what may have you, just feeling like, well, you know what? That's not really for me, because I didn't really see myself in those positions. Just like Senator Jackson mentioned about leadership, I didn't really see myself being a chancellor or a superintendent, so I'm not going to go down that route. But then also taking that leap of faith and actually doing it, and then staying in the field, right? So also supporting these teachers. Your first year teaching is not easy. I mean, anyone can tell you that. Your first year in education, doing anything as an administrator, it's not easy. And most of the times people don't last because they leave and they're not supported. So having these programs, right? Also speaking to integrating the program, fixing the system that way. I think that's where it wouldn't become so forced like it is now. It's more so just having it happen organically and just making it the norm, where it's not just like, okay, so you know what, I have this amount of Black and brown students, but I only have one teacher that looks like them. That's not normal. Even though that seems normal in New York City, because we're used to that, it's not normal and it's not okay, right? So we should always start from the ground. I hope that made some sense. I kind of went in different circles there, because I was thinking about me as a student, but then me as a teacher, but then also, thinking of leaders and administrators. So you got to think of it that way too. I hope that made a little sense for you.
Made a lot of sense, Mahadi. I want to say that it may seem forced to some people, but there has been so much resistance to hiring Black teachers and other teachers of color. And now when we're saying that we need to have more teachers of color in the system, people are saying it's going too fast. It has been held back for so many years. There's a statistic I want to read to you. The research shows that having a racially congruent teacher increases the chances of high school graduation by 30%. Having two increases the chances to 60%. That's significant.
Hey, Bruce, you want to go to the questions from the audience?
I'm trying to find them right now.
Okay.
Okay, so give me a second.
Something quick, there's also studies that show that having at least one Black teacher it results in more success in all children, not just Black children. Like white kids being exposed to Black teachers and Black teachers in power also benefit from that. It's all good. And in addition, in terms of supporting Black teachers, it's not just about recruiting them into this space, it's about addressing the trauma that they experienced while they were in school and creating a safe space for them. It's about recruiting them, it's about retaining them, it's about promoting them, and it's about giving them incentives because they're in there wholeheartedly doing the work, seeing their own kids getting traumatized by the system, carrying the weight of their whole communities, and nobody's acknowledging the extra work that they do to keep our kids afloat.
So important. Question for you, Khalil. Does being a teacher preclude you from running for CEC, even if you have kids in public school?
Yeah, I answered that in the chat. Unfortunately, that's a conflict of interest. But I will say that CECs do partner with teachers all the time. So please come to our meetings and please tell us what your concerns are so we can elevate that.
Thank you. This person said, my question goes to Mahadi and Shankil. Do you feel that textbooks make a difference in your education? And if so, why? Do you feel that not having an updated book that you missed out on some current events? I only ask because I have a similar experience. I went to a school that focused on children with learning disabilities. And I feel that because of the school I went to, the staff felt that some of us would succeed and others would be home.
Absolutely. I totally wholeheartedly believe that. Like I said, I went to a very premier high school in Harlem at the time. And although we had all these opportunities and, you know, we had all these type of incentives and things, we had outdated textbooks. And if you look at the country as a whole, just taking New York City out of the equation, there's some parts of the textbooks in the South that has been modified to eliminate slavery, right? So you see that. So that makes a big difference. And she's shaking her head because when I first read about it, I was distraught about it. Like there's literally a textbook that is, I don't know if it was made by Texas Instruments or who was the publishing house for it, but I do know that it covers the Revolution. It goes to the Civil War, skips right to like Reconstruction. It just skips the middle. And that's important because what you see is that history repeats itself. So I'm an English teacher, but I also, you know, I double majored in English and history during undergrad. And I, I occasionally teach history when they're short as a social studies teacher. So that's my area too. And it makes a huge difference. Like, look at the world we live in today. A lot of these things they're kind of like onsets of things that happened in the past. So when you modify and tweak textbooks or you give outdated text, it gives kids a very narrow-minded or very clouded kind of learning experience, right? Because you need to understand where you came from to know where you're going. And that's another problem we have in our schools with our students is that they don't know where they come from. Sean Kell mentioned earlier that she never learned about her country or she never learned about Africa till she like got to college. And that's sad because what happens is that you'll sit in a college classroom and you won't be able to speak to, you know, specific historical content that happened, right? You won't maybe know how a system of government works, right? We're all about politics, right? And we need to know how things happen or how they get to the way they do. And I think that's another issue that could be a whole nother seminar at a later date. But a lot of the times our students are failing and you see that like that pitfall with our kids because they don't know where they came from or their textbooks are just lacking very vital information that they need to be successful. So absolutely, you need to have updated textbooks. Not only that, updated technology, right? It's no reason that some of our students in certain districts still have like year-old ThinkPads when some schools have iPads, the 2020 Apple iPad or something, or even, I want to say software, right? There's different things that's available now to make remote learning easier, but some school districts don't have the money to purchase it. So then their students are getting a very lackluster education. And you see that a lot too now with remote learning. There's certain resources and software that's available, but some schools can't afford it. So then their school might have a diluted or watered down version of it, but they won't get the same experiences as maybe their counterparts in another district. So everything, textbooks, curriculum, resources, software, technology, all of that needs to be updated, not just the textbooks, but that, yes, absolutely, for sure.
Thank you, Mahadi. Does anyone else want to jump in on that?
I think Mahadi made a great point. She said everything that I wanted to say, but I just, especially like, I want to chime in on the topic of software. I've been in classrooms where some classrooms have chalkboards and the other classrooms have smart boards. And when you think about creating an environment that's all inclusive for students, there's some students that are visual learners, there's some students that are auditory learners, and there's some students that need extra reinforcement just to feel connected to a lesson plan. So for those kids that are still stuck with chalkboards in their classrooms, they're missing out. I've also opened up textbooks, history textbooks that have the Russia still listed as the Soviet Union, and the information is so out of date. And even the French textbooks too, the textbooks are so out of date. They even have the president listed as someone else who's not even the current president. I think all of this, it needs to be fixed, all of it. And even PA systems in schools need to be updated as well too. I took a disability course last semester, and we talked about sound systems and how they can be used in classrooms that do have this up-to-date software, such as sound systems. When you think about NYC public schools, you think about classrooms that are most often overcrowded. Sometimes instead of having 25 students, they have 35 students. So as an educator, when you're teaching a classroom with 35 students, you're either yelling or students are missing out on valuable information. And then it's time to take a Common Core test. And then they fail. And then who gets blamed? The educator and also the students. I think it's just like one affects the other.
Thank you, Shankil. This is a different kind of question from the audience. What are your thoughts on the diversity and admissions pilot that is being used by some high schools for admissions for fall 21? Schools have set aside anywhere from 30% to 60% of seats for applicants eligible for free or reduced lunch.
Go for it. Because what you're doing is you're opening up and having students that may have high marks on their actual tests, diversifying with other students in a learning environment so everyone learns. And basically they're not bringing those students down, but those students are helping to upskill those other students. And from a holistic point of view, that's a good thing. Having the diversity of students as far as their level of performance, diversity as far as male, female, or you know, whether or not they're Black, Latino, or Asian, or Caucasian. That type of diversity is good. I think so. It brings about more of what we would hope and expect our leaders to be, and not be so segregated and narrow-minded and vision focused that it's only about those with wealth or those that look like me, those various things. We need to open it up, in my opinion. So, any other thoughts? What about Aisha or Miss Winfield?
Okay, I'm on the fence about that sort of categorization, especially because me, like as a student, I am a person of color, and I remember missing out on a lot of resources because I did not meet the income bracket. I wasn't upper class, but I certainly wasn't lower class. I was just borderline making it. And I had average grades. And I remember missing out on a lot of resources. And I kind of hate sometimes hearing that categorization, because a lot of times, like some of these schools, and especially some of these, let's say scholarship programs as well, they think of minorities and they think of, okay, automatically you have to be lower class. And there's so many of minorities that aren't lower class, but they're not rich. They're just borderline making it, but they miss out on a lot. Like I missed out on SEEK, so many scholarship programs I was missed out on. I missed out on financial aid. Like I missed out on quite a lot. And there's a lot of students who are in the same situation as me, and we're like stuck.
Hey, Ms. Winfield, I don't, when we talk about income levels, that's not class. It's the economic status, how much your family earns. Has nothing to do with class. So middle class, higher middle class, poor class. No, it's not about class. It's about income only. So that's what when people say, well, I'm middle class. I'm sorry, what's middle class? Tell me what that is. What is it? Oh, it's about how much money, my family earns. Well, that has nothing to do with class. So that's just me, but others would say, no, it is, because that's what we have been drilled in our mind, upper class, middle class, poor class, or whatever situation. And that has to do with part of the racism that exists in the system.
I think I'm just using the upper class, middle class, or lower class because it's just so ingrained in my mind.
That's what I
and
said.
It's something that's so I think that's why I automatically thought of that.
I just want to add really quickly that students that fall into the category of free reduced lunch don't have access to a lot of resources. So while students that have parents that have a higher income where they may not be eligible for certain programs, as a community and as a family, you might have exposure to different experiences that could also be beneficial for you. Whereas somebody that's a free reduced lunch, whose parents are working 3 jobs, who don't have these resources, who don't travel, who don't do these things, typically need or would benefit from these enriched environments. And so different schools are using a bracket for admissions because we don't see a lot of these students in the more affluent schools. And so I agree with Senator Jackson, where this would be an absolute benefit to integrating our schools and creating more diversity in our school system.
A connected question then. Thank you. I feel we see representation as a general trend, but the system still holds and perpetuates the biases. Systems tend to change individuals over their careers more than individuals change systems. A wide solidarity movement is really needed to change systems substantially. I feel like we need to have a list of the top changes the system must make to desegregate.
Wow. Who's going to answer that? Hey, Bruce, can you just restate it?
Well, there are a couple of things here that systems actually have more of an impact on individuals than individuals have on the system, unless it seems to me they're saying, unless we organize, create a movement of people. He says a wide solidarity movement is really needed to change systems substantially.
Yeah, I was agreeing. As far as answering, I was basically just nodding my head in agreement, because I do think that it takes anything, you have to be organized, right? You can't get anything done unless you have an organized type of movement. I think you also need to give more students, parents, as well as educators a voice, right? It shouldn't just be top down. Some of the best leadership approaches are those collaborative leadership approaches where everyone works together synonymously. So I don't think that it's one person's job. We should just depend heavily on upper leadership to do it, or middle or lower. I think collaboratively, everyone should have a voice, and even the students, because you can look at this panel right now and we're speaking from personal experience, right? Myself, the panelists, you, Bruce, you spoke about you being an educator, Senator Jackson, like we all evidently have a commonality, and it's that we all experience this to some degree. So if everyone here, just as we had this panel, would be part of that committee that makes that change, or that movement, that progressive movement, then more can get done. A lot of the times you do see that, you know, the system would change a person more than they can make change when it's top down. They can't really do anything. They just have to kind of do what they're told. It's kind of like, okay, well, you know what? I'm just going to be a robot. I'm just going to go in and just, you know, treat it like a job rather than treating it like a movement and making a change for it. So having these conversations, having these seminars, opening the space for the creativity, the speaking, hearing people's experiences, you have to break something down before you can build it up, right? So that's the foundation of it too. And I think whoever did share that question, but it was a loaded question, it was a bunch of questions in one, it was a great. And I think you kind of answered your own question in asking the question, because it was very well articulated. And I think that's what you have to do. So in order to build something up, you got to break it down, and you got to build it as a team. You know, buildings are not built with one person. There's a bunch of construction workers, right? So we're all just construction workers in this whole system of whatever development we're trying to build, and we have to work together. So I think that's where the bulk of it comes from.
Just to piggyback, Mahadi's right. This is a system. We have to dismantle it. We have to disrupt it. We have to tear it apart. And the only way that we can do that is if we work collectively. And so again, just understanding the governance system within the Department of Education, but how to continue to advocate. I think the last 5 years, youth organizations have taken the lead. Integrate NYC, Teens Take Charge, Brotherhood Sister Soul, Sister Brothers United. I mean, I can tell you about at least 6 or 7 youth-led organizations that are really challenging the status quo and pushing these questions. And now these youth organizations are partnering with parent allies, adult allies, to continue to push and disrupt. But I also think that it's a call to action for the folks in the School of Ed. Like now, how are you as a School of Ed, CCNY, who literally played a role in creating progressive schools across the city and changing that status quo? How are you going to push these conversations forward? It's not just about hosting us tonight, but it's about calling on the mayor, calling on the chancellor to make these changes so that we can continue to change policies and substantiate and support the movement to integrate our schools.
I think that's a good place for us to stop. Thank you so much, Kaliris. Thank you, Mahadi. Thank you, Shankil. Thank you, Senator Robert Jackson. Thank you, Aisha and Natia. It's been, for me, I'm trying to keep up. I'm writing notes about everything. I'm trying to read the chat room, and the ideas have flowed so quickly that I can't keep up with it. But one of the things that I'm seeing is that there need to be systemic changes, but there also need to be changes on the classroom level. There have to be changes, for instance, in personnel. There have to be changes in the way we support the people that want to go into education. I work with student teachers all the time. I am blown away by the enthusiasm that people have. And yet we need to know how to support the people who want to go into education, because without support, people just leave. And that's a loss for the system, and it's a loss for everyone who was devoted at the beginning but didn't get the proper support. And that's support with how children learn, with creating communities in our classrooms, with getting the funding that we need, with getting the support that teachers need so that they're not constantly looking over their back to see who's trying to find out something wrong that they have done. And people have raised the question of what are we doing in the School of Education so that we are helping to promote teachers of color. And so they were helping to promote teachers of color and people like me who have to be sensitive to cultural difference and supporting all of the children in our classes. So I want to thank everyone who's participated. I do want to say that we're looking at later in the spring to have a discussion about the changes in admissions procedures for middle schools. and how those can help to desegregate and possibly integrate those schools. Our next event is going to be a workshop that we're calling, a discussion that we're calling The Having of Wonderful Ideas, a conversation about Jean Piaget. For us in education, Jean Piaget is a leading force. And we have people who have studied Piaget over the long time and someone who has worked as a simultaneous translator for Piaget, who are going to have a conversation about Piaget. So that will be on March 3rd, and I hope that people will participate in that. And thanks everyone for being here tonight. Please stay safe, and we hope to see you soon.